it's my very great pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce the last in this year's series of inaugural lectures in history, and to introduce to you our new Professor of Modern History, Lynn Abrams. Now, Lynn is no stranger to Glasgow. She has been here for a considerable part of her career, since 1995, and was promoted to a personal chair in 2002 when she took the title of Professor of Gender History. But very significantly, in the history of this very illustrious chair, which was founded in 1893, Lynn is the first woman to hold the post. And I think that the composition of the audience here today, including many people both from on campus and from off campus, is a tribute to Lynn's ability to cross different groups in and out of the academic world, as so much of her research in recent years has been doing. Now, Lynn, as I think many people know, started off in the labour and social and gender history of 19th and 20th century Germany, and her move to Glasgow in 1995 was accompanied by a shift into Scottish history, which has actually brought her nearer and nearer and nearer to home, from Shetland first, and now to Clydebank and East Kilbride. And in addition to Lynn's many publications on German gender history and Scottish gender history in book form and in article form, she combines the methodology, the distinctive methodologies of being an oral historian and a gender historian. And those are underpinning these new recent projects and her success in building on what was already a very strong and is now a wonderfully imaginative, strong grants portfolio which Lynn has acquired. She has now 2 collaborative doctoral awards to work with students on the massive archive of the Singer's sewing machine factory in Clydebank, a project called From Local to Global, but also a large Leverhulme Trust award to work on post-war housing and the social and gender implications of the renewal of Glasgow's housing stock in East Kilbride in the post-war years. Lynn's going to talk to us drawing on her work as an oral historian, as a feminist historian, not only in and around the Greater Glasgow area, but also further afield. And it's with great pleasure that I ask her to address us today on the subject of speaking the self, women narrating liberation in post-war Britain. Lynn.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Julia. And I'll just start off by saying how honoured I am to occupy this chair in modern history, how delighted I am to be speaking in this lovely lecture theatre, and really how delighted I am that so many people have come along tonight, including many of my friends. So it's lovely to have you here. Okay, doing history these days can be a very personal business. For feminist scholars, what is scholarly and what is personal is often very hard to disentangle. Our feminist selves are bound up in our academic personas. Our research enthusiasms are intertwined with our autobiographies. We often find ourselves immersed in projects which have meaning at some personal level. Doing history can make us into a different person. At the start of her autobiographical account of 1968 in Italy, a study which combines personal memory, her own experience of psychoanalysis, and the life stories of activists, Luisa Passerini, renowned feminist and pioneer of oral history, writes this. She said, "I conducted my first interviews with the protagonists of 68. The interviews plunge me into my own past. As I listen, the film of what I was doing at the time unreels. Memory redoubled in this way is very hard to bear. It seems to me that until now no one has wanted to take on this burden, sometimes not even those who tell their stories. The mirror I see my image reflected in is opaque." But at the end of an account, which is often, I think, quite painfully raw, she concludes this: "Only now is the complementary nature of my 2 undertakings evident. If I had not heard the life stories of the generations of 68, I would not have been able to write about myself. These stories have nourished mine, giving it the strength to get to its feet and to speak. But I couldn't have borne them in their alternation of being too full and too empty, if I had not confronted myself and my history with the double motion of analysis and the exercise of remembering. The act or process of self-making and self-knowledge, as Pasolini makes clear, is continuous and it's relational. It operates on several levels, the internal and the external, the subjective and the intersubjective, the personal and the social. And I quote Pasolini to start with, not to draw parallels with my historical journey, as I have not so far delved into a past in which I have a personal investment. But her experience of using historical research to come to terms with herself is perhaps an experience that many of us would recognise. In recent decades, the significance of the self has become more prominent in historical writing. In particular, the rise of feminist, gay, lesbian, black, subaltern histories has challenged the white male and middle-class perspective of so much historical narrative, often from a personal perspective and likewise stressing agency, the capacity to make personal choice, which in turn affect events. Historians of women, in particular, have been to the fore in putting the personal into the historical. And many of us have focused on personal testimony and life writing as the way to access expressions of the self on the part of historical actors. Of course, the self is not an innate entity which an individual inherits. In other words, the self is not essential, determined by enduring and innate qualities. Rather, it is a cultural construction. We construct ourself, our identity, in relation to culture. It's mediated then through a series of discourses, and one of the ways which we construct the self is by telling stories about ourselves. Indeed, one of the features of modernity is self-narration, whereby one's identity is expressed in the telling of a story about the self in a whole variety of forms. What we might call self-telling is a feature of our modern confessional culture, in which self-revelation and personal testimony may be expressed via the broadcast and print media like the celebrity interview, the reality programme, the pages of magazines, autobiographies, and of course legitimated and sustained by social media and backed up by the widespread use of counselling, therapists and talking cures. There's little inhibition today about revealing the self or a version of the self to an audience, to the public. So all of this provides those of us deploying oral history with very fertile ground. Decades of oral history practice have taught us that interrogation of an individual's life story does much more than offer us empirical evidence about the past. The telling of a life story is a complex narrative performance which requires attention to the use of language, the deployment of narrative structure, the articulation of memory, the context within which the life is narrated, and in other words, all the devices by which a person represents the self in oral fashion. And having blazed the trail for the use of life story narratives within the historical profession, oral historians found that these sources, while certainly offering data, had to be studied as documents of interiority, as expressions of consciousness. Moreover, the life history, as told in an oral history interview, is not just an opportunity for the respondent to articulate a pre-existing or ready-made sense of self to which the interviewer then proceeds to gain access. Rather, that interview is a means by which subjectivity or the sense of self is constructed and reconstructed through the active process of the telling of memory stories. The revelation of the self, understood as the autonomous and self-contained individual who possesses a rich and complex inner life or consciousness, has become one of the key aims of oral historians. Over the past few years, I have been conducting oral history interviews with women of the so-called transition generation as a means of accessing stories of female liberation before the advent of the women's liberation movement. Born in the 1940s, ahead of the baby boomers but missing the war, growing up in the opportunity-laden years of the 60s and early 70s, when education and careers for women were expanding and traditional expectations were slipping away, this group of women are in the vanguard of the late modern project of self-articulation and self-realization. They personify a revolution in self-understanding. In their actions and in their words, these women encapsulate the shift in the ways in which women constitute themselves in modern society. No longer constrained by role expectations and conventions, they have embraced self-fulfillment and self-realization. They did not require feminism to achieve this. Most were not aligned with or active within second-wave feminism of the 70s and 80s, but in speaking about their lives, they draw upon the language and frameworks made commonplace by feminism's success in creating a template for women to speak about their personal experiences and be heard. Since the Second World War, and more especially since the 1960s, the language of self-fulfillment and of personal autonomy has become ubiquitous in popular and scholarly discourse. The notion of the self-actualizing individual in a quest for self-discovery and authenticity, what we might describe as the modern psychological selfhood, informed and legitimized by the psychological sciences, has replaced self-control, social obligation, and restraint as the guiding forces in life story accounts, and particularly in accounts given by women. And indeed, historians have capitalised on the personal or biographical turn in culture by using it to access experience via the various forms of self-expression or personal testimony, the autobiography, the diary, letters, and oral history. So the idea that the modern individual was his or her own invention, unhinged from the social constraints of respectability, conformity, and self-control, has in turn fed the scholarly obsession with the practices of self-realisation and reflexivity. For women, the quest for the self in the post-war era is closely bound up with the advent of second-wave feminism. The notion of the essentialist self contained within the biological body of woman has been seen as particularly debilitating. So the liberation of women from a deterministic framework and the argument that the self is constructed by the subject through dialogue was a key component of feminist writing and campaigning, actualised in consciousness-raising groups and in the slogan, "The personal is political." The idea of the liberated female self emerged from the women's movement as a response to the insights learned from writers like de Beauvoir, Friedan, Greer, and many others, that woman was subsumed within cultural expectations and norms and was unable to express her authentic experience. The legitimation of women's experience by listening to their stories and by using those stories to inform an understanding of women's position in society in the past and in the present came to be a plank of the emancipation struggle and the ongoing project of feminist scholarship, which was driven by a commitment to research by, about, and for women. So this is a circular reinforcing process. Each voice or story narrated serves to offer an alternative historical narrative for other women who then feel freer to relate their own experiences. The silence of women in the past has been something of a truism for historians. Women's voices can be hard to find, particularly because their words were often not deemed worthy of recording or because they were not allowed to speak. Historians of all periods have shown how women's speech was disciplined, but it's precisely this evidence of the attempt to control women's speech that signifies the power of the words uttered. So feminist historians have been at the forefront of reclaiming women's words, demonstrating how what women said in public was perceived by the recipient of a defamatory slur as damaging to his or her status, and in turn their ability to conduct their affairs. So calling another woman a whore or accusing her of theft could undermine her claims to respectability and thus her likelihood perhaps of finding a husband, or her credit worthiness, damaging her ability to do business. Yet just as women's speech had the power to do harm to another, women's speech could also be redemptive when the right words were spoken. A woman who used language likely to be deemed appropriate was more likely to be heard. A 19th century example from Shetland, where in an earlier research project I discovered the past and present power of women's words to shape a history, demonstrates this point. Betsy Nicholson, the victim of domestic violence, suddenly withdrew her complaint against her husband, citing his newfound religiosity. Her words simultaneously spoke of forgiveness and served to present to the authorities a female self that conformed to the idealised female gender role, thereby ensuring that she would be listened to. For historians of women and of gender, much time and effort has been expended on finding women's voices, interpreting their words, explaining their silence. In history, as well as in other disciplines, the recovery of women's voices and women's stories was regarded as an essential first step towards redressing the balance in scholarship and thereafter rewriting the historical narrative, not only to include women's experiences, but to make those experiences count, and in many instances to alter the terms of the debate. So the shift in scholarship to embrace the narrative turn has given attention to voice an added dimension. It's through narrative or stories that the self is constructed and articulated. Selves are constituted through the act of speaking, the act of narrating. Giving voice to personal experience, then, is an empowering act. For women and for feminists, there is an added dimension to that empowerment. In speaking, one is legitimising one's experiences in public and in a society in which women's experiences have in the past been regarded as marginal and their voices silenced or muted. So the performance of speaking reconstitutes the autonomous self over and over again. And as Mary Beard has recently and trenchantly pointed out, women's voices need to be heard in public. We do not only speak for ourselves, we speak for other women who are silent. So I took you to Shetland a minute ago, and I want to just stay in Shetland a little bit longer, because here in this most northerly archipelago of the British Isles, we have a rather unique place in the 19th and 20th centuries. A place where men were outnumbered by women, where female-headed and female-only households were commonplace, where women played a central role in sustaining the economy. This was not a place for silent and retiring women. Shetland's female culture, nurtured through female networks and reciprocity, was, and still is, I would argue, maintained and reinforced by stories narrated by women in literature and in oral culture, in storytelling, folk narratives and oral history. Researching women's lives in Shetland's past started out for me in the archive, but it soon became a process reliant on and indeed refracted through women's own understandings and interpretations of their present and past lives. Women told me stories about women which used personal experiences to evoke a past that was relevant and significant in the present, and which in turn legitimised versions of Shetland's history which positioned women at the centre of it. In speaking, to paraphrase Angela Carter's words, they were validating their claim to a fair share of the future by staking their claim to a share of the past. Their storytelling establishes female authority. Speaking in this context is a performance act. A female narrator's assertion of narrative competence is significant to establish veracity and authority. Now, one particular female storyteller, called Mary Manson, has been instrumental in opening up for me a new way of doing history that listened harder, that took women's words as an entree to a new interpretation of the past. So in the spirit of this lecture, I want you to hear Mary Manson speaking, because listening to her voice does take us to another place. It's a conduit to a past that respects Indigenous woman-centred interpretations of how that past was experienced and understood. And the story I'm just going to play you just a snippet of today is called The Story of the Bottle of Medicine, and it tells a journey undertaken by two girls across the Shetland landscape to fetch a cure for a sick relative from a wise woman. And it's a memory practice that provides a path to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of a culture. And this little extract just gives you the central magical moment of the story.
Boy. So Mommy said they could lie no longer, for they were never fond of sleeping yet. She got up and she tried, there was a chunk at the door. And she got up and she tried to peep out there, see what was going on. And she said that the old wife was sitting over the hearthstone, all those pots and pans, and a great pot hanging at the crook, boiling with us mixture. So, anyway, she said she raised up, she could almost swear that she never made any noise at all. The people out there's chunk. And of course, this old wife was sitting with her back to her. And she never cared that she let out a shout, she says. Lie down, she says, and fall asleep. That's meaning, she says. I can, she says, our will that you're watching me. You're going to destroy the medicine. So Mommy said she got down as fast as she got up. And of course then after a while then she came and drew the doors of the so she says, you hear a long journey for you, she says, you'll maybe hit a rise, she says, and get you ready to give.
Stories are then what we live by. We tell stories about ourselves that position us in the world and serve the purpose of legitimising our experiences. So Mary Manson, who you just heard speaking, told a story of women's independence, autonomy and power. Her script, the backdrop, if you like, was the common understanding in Shetland of a female culture that valued those attributes in women. Although telling a tale that seems somewhat unhinged from what we might call public history, her narration can be used as an entry point to a world which rarely appears in the printed records. Now, it might seem a long way from Mary Manson's Shetland to 21st century stories of liberation, but the aim of feminist scholarship in oral history was based on a simple assumption. In the words of pioneer feminist oral historians Shirna Gluck and Daphne Patai, through our work of framing, presenting, interpreting, analysing and making the work public, we believed that we were contributing to the larger collectivity of women, making a kind of return. By documenting women's representations of their own reality, we were engaging in advocacy. We felt that our work was indeed political and that it was for women. Just as Mary Manson's voice then was validated by a larger story about women's cultural power that had been salient in Shetland, the voices of women who have grown up in the post-World War II era are shaped by and give authority to the script of 20th century feminism. So feminism provides, in a very general sense, a script for living and for telling the story of a life, in that it legitimises the belief in gender equality and thereby provides a framework for living and talking about a female self with autonomous ambitions and desires, liberated from the self-regulation that characterised earlier generations of women. So the point here is that feminism provides a retrospective framework of analysis. It doesn't matter whether women ascribe to feminist beliefs or belong to a feminist organisation. The feminist framework is one that liberates the female self. And this is seen most clearly in the life stories of feminist activists, a group which self-consciously aligned beliefs with identity. But I would argue that feminism was equally as powerful as a framing mechanism for women who were not active in the movement, and even those who did not adhere consciously to its tenets, in terms of the way in which women conceive of and construct the liberated female self. So in the rest of this lecture, I want to explore how they do this, drawing on a series of interviews with women undertaken in the last 4 or 5 years. For psychotherapists and theorists, differentiating the self from the other is a key marker of the unique or autonomous self. This feature of linguistic self-narration has been identified as distinctively Western and in the past tended to be more applicable to white males. Other cultural traditions, women, minorities, it was argued, were more likely to identify themselves relationally with others, as opposed to shaping a sense of self distinguishable from others. However, women who have lived through the era of women's emancipation since the late 60s are arguably just as likely as men to be able to establish for themselves a distinct or separate sense of self. For many women of this generation, in order to achieve an independence of self, they had to reject the model of womanhood represented by their mothers, both as a generation of women who represented a set of values and ways of being, and sometimes as individual mothers. And they do this in both rather banal and also sometimes quite profound ways. So here one of my respondents explicitly distinguishes herself from her mother and her mother's generation in an exchange about her tomboy appearance, of which her mother disapproved. The judgment Deborah makes about her mother's standards separates her own sense of self from that of her mother and her mother's generation. And I won't read out all the quotations because I think you can read them quite quickly for yourself. One of the easiest ways of speaking about this differentiation, of course, was in terms of dress. The short skirts and 60s fashions that were so accessible and physically liberating offered women an easy way in both time dimensions, by which I mean in the moment of the interview and at the time of the experience, of differentiating themselves in terms of appearance, which was of course often only the beginning of a more profound distancing from the values of one's mother's generation. The contrast vividly drawn by so many of my respondents between the tweed suits and twin sets of the mothers and the looser and more expressive fashions of their own era was actually a safe mode of self-differentiation for the interview. So here is my respondent Elise speaking about her first visit to Glasgow School of Art in 1959, I think it is.
When I went for my interview, I nearly died of fright because everybody looked so, I mean, coming from Crieff, everybody looked so incredibly knowing and gorgeous, and the first person I saw was a boy walking down the steps in an ochre-coloured corduroy suit, and I thought, this is phenomenal.
That would have been quite trendy at the time.
Oh, my goodness. And everybody, all the boys wore denims. I'd never seen a pair of jeans, I don't think. No, I mean, you cannot imagine. I was in a pleated skirt and a twin set, I suppose. And flat shoes, and there were all the boys wore desert boots. I don't know if they're a bit like Ugg boots, kind of goldy kind of thingies you got from Millet's army and navy stores. So they were all, half of them had beards and the rest of them had long hair. Fantastic. And the girls all had long hair and they were all beautiful. They weren't. By the time I got there, they weren't, I suppose. But that first interview day and day one.
Stop it there. Okay, the journeys taken by the post-war generation of women took them away from their mother's generation and from the values that had constrained their mother's opportunities. Given the chance to forge a life different from that of their mothers, embracing education and careers, adopting new relationship models, moving away from home, travelling overseas, forging paths in life that were not always dependent on men, these women grabbed the opportunities offered to them, enabling them to live a new kind of life, in some cases living the life that their mothers envied but could not quite come to terms with. But the journey often involved more than just arguments over hemlines. They led to considerable tensions and conflicts between the generational standpoints. The very existence of these tensions, as well as the narrating of them in the interview, served the purpose of differentiation, both at the time they were occurring and subsequently in the interview. The point I'm trying to make is that the interviewee is trying to access her past self, and she does this by telling stories about clothes, which is easy, maybe about sex, which is difficult. But that self is largely in the past and can only be described and not experienced. But in the process of doing this, she is narrating a present self. The self who can look back and reflect on the woman she was through the prism of the person she is now. This reflexivity is not, as some historians would argue, a gauze or a curtain that intervenes between the present and the past, effectively obscuring or polluting the authentic past self, but it's a valuable process which reveals the narrator trying to reconcile past and present selves. She grapples with two narratives then, in the process distinguishing between the person doing the telling and the person as the subject of the story. And it is in the interstices between these that we can begin to understand how the self is constructed over time. And it's easiest to explain how this happens with an example. So let's return to Deborah, who we heard earlier speaking, or who we saw speaking, about how she didn't live up to her mother's expectations in terms of how she turned herself out. Later on, Deborah introduces reflexivity into her narrative, and here she reflects on the attitude towards religion and the expectation that she would be confirmed in the Church of England in her teenage years. And the key sections which indicate the active self-reflection in the course of this story I've highlighted in the text. For some, though, the conformity and the rejection of that conformity had much deeper ramifications. Pam struggled to describe to me the girl she had been. Pam was brought up in a working-class Catholic family in Glasgow. She attended the local Catholic primary school. She graduated at a girls' convent school, was a student at the Catholic Teacher Training College in Glasgow, and she eventually ended up as a primary school teacher back at her old primary school. Her narration of her life story up to the age of about 18 was fraught with difficulty because this stage in her life was characterised by conformity and passivity to a culture and a religion which no longer really had much place in her life. And in fact, she told this part of her story in the third person, as though she was speaking of someone else. When asked to comment on her demeanour whilst at secondary school, she remarked, "You accepted it because you had never met a nun before. You thought this was normal. You thought that that was what they said had to be true. How they taught you to behave was the right way to behave. How they taught you not to think. At the time, it was what you thought happened. You didn't question it. You didn't like it. But you thought that was your own fault. And it was actually much later that you began to realise that this was an abomination. This really didn't teach you to think at all. First of all, you aimed to be a nun." She went on to try to describe how she was brought up in a culture which constrained girls' opportunities. "No ambition," she said, "but you kept in this very careful, restrained Catholic box and did it for another generation, and that's the lasting impression I have of it." Narrating this part of her life was difficult for Pam. She spoke softly and in the third person, almost as if herself was subsumed within the culture she was describing. And as she talked about her girlhood and young adulthood and her journey from convent school to Catholic teacher training college and then back to becoming a primary school teacher, she struggled to find her voice, struggled to articulate the woman she was then, and that is because she is a different woman today. In 1969, Pam's life changed. One might say she experienced a personal epiphany, recognised at the time as a momentous change in her life, but also as related in the interview. Engaged to be married, she called off the wedding at the last moment. She resigned her teaching job and she found employment overseas. So I'll just play you a little bit of her story.
No, this will not do. I broke off just very, very shortly before the wedding. Right. So we are not doing this. So that was quite a trauma. And again, that wasn't done. That was kind of... Anyhow, that was done. Very great support from parents. No, this was not done. Right. Many years later, realised that they hadn't liked him anyway, but they never said. They never ever said. So I'm... trauma, great trauma, great shock, great scandal, but okay. And I resigned my teaching job and went off to Spain.
Oh, wow. Yes. Yeah. So how old were you then?
It must have been 68 or 69, I've kind of forgotten. It was the late 60s.
Yeah.
Right, I had to get a teaching job again, so I looked in all in the Times Ed for a job abroad because I would get out of here. Right. I found a fabulous job in the south of Spain teaching in an American school where they were building a big refinery down on the coast. And they had a tiny little school with about 12 pupils. And they were looking for a teacher for the middle school. So I looked at that and got that and off I went. I had a fabulous time. And that's when I really found boys and men and life.
Isn't that interesting? You sound like a completely different... You kind of went from being one person to a completely different person.
Yes, I did.
So the process of breaking away and differentiating herself was narrated as a story of her journey out of the community where she had been brought up. In the process, defining a new sense of self. But that differentiation was also articulated through the way she spoke. The passive Catholic girl who did not question the direction of her life was spoken in the third person and with reticence, almost as if Pam had become that girl again. But once the break had been made, in contrast to the narration of her earlier life, Pam began to speak about herself in the first person and with more brio. For the first time, she was in control of decision-making. The passive Catholic schoolgirl, following the path mapped out for her, had become the decisive woman. Pam was performing the two versions of herself, the quiet Catholic girl and the more confident adult woman. Indeed, the self she was happy presenting to me in the interview. Which brings me neatly to the second way in which women presented themselves in the interview context by differentiating a self with which they felt comfortable, usually an identity which once grasped had sustained them more or less to the present day, from a past self. Becoming someone else, for most people, is a gradual process which we may not even be consciously aware of. But for some, there is an abrupt shift or rupture. And as I said before, we might even call it an epiphany, which in real time and at the point of recollection in the interview marks a moment of acute realisation. It often takes the form of a significant event, remembered, recounted, and used to explain something, and in the moment of the oral history interview, expressed not just in the words said, but in the ways in which those words are expressed. And the purpose of that moment is to make a bridge between past and present self and to achieve coherence, or what oral historians commonly call composure, a state in which the narrator is able to align her life story with general discourses and with which she feels comfortable or composed. So Pam, who I just introduced you to, was able to achieve this narrative composure despite the trauma of the cancelled wedding, by telling the story of the job in Spain. And that allowed her to reconcile two quite contrasting selves and to show that she had rejected that old submissive self, that she had indeed embraced autonomy and independence. And this acted as a perfect jumping off point for the rest of her life story. In short, it allowed her to achieve composure by presenting herself as a modern woman, unfettered by traditional notions of what was acceptable or possible, and demonstrating individual self-worth, entitlement, self-propulsion, and independence. The embrace of a new identity in some cases was done by the adoption of a new name. So Elise, who you will recall was excited by Glasgow School of Art and desperate to refashion herself, dropped her given name and called herself something else that she believed was more fitting. And in fact, she told me this at the very start of the interview. So she said, when I asked her name, Elise, although actually christened Elizabeth and called Elspeth all my school days, then in a fit of ridiculousness changed my name from Elspeth to Elise. We may cover that later. It's not important. I think it is important. But later, she explained that she changed her name on arrival at Glasgow School of Art. But that was when I changed from Elspeth to Elise, because Elspeth did not seem to fit with the desert boots and denims that I wanted to join. It's pathetic, I know, it's pathetic. And then later on, she mentioned it again. And I desperately wanted to look like Juliet Greco, all these people you may not have heard of, and Paris, and which is why I didn't want my name to be Elspeth, because Juliet Greco and Jean-Paul Sartre wouldn't be able to say Elspeth. I must say, I think she had a point. Similarly, Susanna changed her name to Susie on arrival at one of the United Kingdom's new universities in the early 60s. In the course of her story, Susanna identified a number of significant moments which signal her journey away from her mother's expectations and values, or at least those she projected onto her daughter at that time, towards an independent selfhood. And here Susanna tells a story about her arrival at university in 1966, which I think quite nicely just encapsulates the first stage in the process by which she came to define the woman she wanted to be, as opposed to the woman her mother thought she should be. So I won't read out the whole of this extract, but the key bit is in the middle, when she says, when I went to university, I remember standing in the queue to register and two things happened. One, people asked me my name and I said it was Susanna, and they would say, yes, but what do people call you? And I decided that Susanna obviously wasn't acceptable, so I said Susie, and for most of the 70s until I met my husband, I was called Susie. And then she also tells a story also about not admitting what school she went to as well. And I said, in a kind of leading question at the end, so you kind of recreated yourself? And she said, yes, I recreated myself, and that was, you know, I had a wonderful time. But taking a new name, of course, was easy compared with the process of embracing a set of values that were in opposition to those held or professed to be held by parents. Our name, of course, is simply just an external identifier of the person we feel or want ourselves to be. What is more important is the story or stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, which we then in turn tell others, thereby completing a circle of self-understanding and a narrative by which we can live. The oral history interview is just one of the occasions when this occurs. And because of its nature, it's unusual, actually, for a person to be asked to tell their life story to someone who is genuinely interested and who will give it their undivided attention. So in that sense, the oral history interview creates a space for self-narration unconstrained by factors which might be present in other contexts. It's in this context then that women narrate selves which are what we might describe as authentic, deriving from personal experience, personal interpretations of that experience, and not necessarily dependent on versions of the past which have been validated by other authorities, maybe validated by, say, history with a capital H, or public history. Though in order for these stories to be plausible and intelligible, they do need to hook on to various commonly held ideas or interpretations of the past. So I've already said that feminism as an ideology and a movement did not, on the whole, provide the frame for post-war women's self-narratives, but the more commonly held belief systems of gender equality, equality of opportunity, and to a degree liberal attitudes to sexuality and personal relationships did provide women with a way to understand and order their life stories, even when those stories seem to lack coherence. Those belief systems have not only facilitated women's advancement, their achievement of personal autonomy and independence, they have also given them a voice. The feminist and socialist activist Sheila Rowbottom wrote in her autobiography, "Finding ourselves being women in new ways, many of us were precipitated into conceiving alternative means of becoming women. The particular circumstances of the post-war decades certainly offered some girls the opportunity to become very different women." Ruth was brought up in a respectable working-class family, as she described it, in London and Kent. She became an evangelical Christian in her teens, converting her parents, and at this stage in her life, religion was the means she used to differentiate herself from her mother in a rather interesting reversal of roles. She said, "I can remember disapproving of my mother because she wore lipstick to church and being horribly mean to her about it, saying she was an embarrassment, and she did her vacuuming on Sundays, which was also very prohibited, so I must have been absolutely obnoxious." After going to Cambridge and being heavily involved in Christian groups throughout her university years, Ruth then jettisoned religion in her 20s, and instead she found radical politics and feminism. And she explained to me how an opportunity to study overseas provided the turning point. And again, this is quite a slightly long extract. I'm not going to play it for you. But she explains how, she says, "I knew that I didn't believe anymore. I got to somehow separate myself from the church because all my friends were in it and my family. So I came to McMaster, and with the conscious idea that I was rethinking everything about my life." And then she became involved in Labour politics and the politics of race in Hamilton and in Canada, and she was exposed to lots of different types of people and lots of different types of thinking. But Ruth had always been socially and politically active. Her life story is peppered with references to CND, Marxism, feminism and radical politics. After Cambridge, she trained for social work in London's East End. She taught English in Thailand and then spent much of her career in academia, researching and teaching women's writing. So not surprisingly, Ruth's narrative, which is rich and complex, achieves coherence through a belief in gender equality. And indeed, the incoherence, which might have occurred as a result of that religious conversion and then rejection, was smoothed over by her ability in the interview to find in each episode a kind of feminist moment. Her description of her and her mother's involvement in the church is a good example, as Ruth incorporates into this story about Sunday school a vignette about an inspirational woman missionary and another about her mother's restricted life chances.
And she was this tiny woman, and I can remember being absolutely inspired by her because she was a maid, as my grandmother had been, in a big household, and she saved all her savings, and when she was in her early 20s, she just went and bought herself a one-way ticket to China and took off, and went and found some missionaries there and went and worked with them. And in the end, when the Communist Revolution happened, she marched a bunch of kids across the mountains and ended up in Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and became a heroine. And we were given a lot of really strong models of women who were not married and who were not tied down to their family. And I think my mother always regretted leaving. She had worked for Kodak before she was married. She regretted not working after she was married. Right. She got bored. She used to take evening classes and things. But she always used to say to me, "Don't learn to cook and don't learn to type."
Yeah.
or you'll end up like me.
Yeah, although one always wishes you'd learned to type, really.
You might have heard me say at the end, and we wish we'd all learned to type. And in relating tales of Girton College, Cambridge in the 1960s, she highlighted the sexism her and her fellow female students experienced, and I won't read that one out, you could read it for yourself. Ruth's story conforms to a model of successful post-war womanhood, predicated on the opportunities to be gained by education, and education so often denied their mother's generation, and the legitimation of the journey taken by the ideology of feminism. She fashioned herself, finding her own way, embracing a new way of becoming a woman in the first instance via evangelical Christianity, but later through study, social work, travel, and involvement in left politics and social action. By the time Ruth spoke to me, she had a very coherent story to tell, and a voice with which to tell it, having been a feminist academic for most of her adult life. The self she presented in interview was a feminist self, shaped and legitimised by post-war feminism. Moreover, her own academic research into feminist autobiography provided her with a template for speaking the self. Her story was coherent, empowered, authoritative, and in speaking to me, another feminist academic, she was able to articulate this story with ease. For these women, it's not differentiation that's central to the formation of self, but finding a place where the self can flourish and grow. That could be social action, higher education, voluntary work, organisations like the National Housewives Register and the Playgroup Movement, the National Childbirth Trust, or the Open University, all of which predated second wave feminism, but many of which were very important to many of the women I interviewed. Jennifer did not go to university, but instead she married young as a kind of rebellion and means of escape, ending up as a farmer's wife in the remote Scottish borders. She had a more indirect route to the feminist self. I asked her about her feminism, and she said, there was feminism in my head, and that was about being, being a woman and wanting to get out and carry on with what I'd left behind at school and post-school. Because at school, a girls' grammar school, you go to school and you know all the women there, a lot of them were, their fiancés had been killed in the war. Those were the sort of teachers we had largely. And the world was our oyster, a bit like Jean Brodie, isn't it? It wasn't quite like that, but it was never said to us, but the world was our oyster, and a lot of them went on to university or to teach training college and into nursing. I didn't do any of those, which was something to do with my upbringing. And so then for me, it was a huge shock to get into the working world and realise I was a second-class citizen, because I felt like one. I was just the woman. I was a secretary. I'd never get the boss's job because I was a woman, because I was very aware of that. I don't know why I married somebody and went into farming, probably to get away from all of that, a bit more romantic. Well, ultimately though, the route to embracing a new sense of self for Jennifer was actually the Guardian newspaper, which she found very difficult to get in Moffat, the feminist magazine Spare Rib, the Moffat branch of the National Women's Register, the Open University, and a job in a local action centre. When her marriage broke down, she moved to Dumfries to work in the Action Centre full-time, and that was a springboard to a move to London, where she became involved in feminist groups and came out as a lesbian. Jennifer narrated her liberation story as a story of discovery. And liberation for her, like all my other respondents, was, I think, the freedom to be true to the self. In the dialogic relationship of the interview with me, a feminist historian, Jennifer and her counterparts articulated or brought into being a self both by describing the action of the character in the story, herself, and in the act of speaking. The performance of speaking, of telling a liberation story, albeit not the classic story of finding the women's movement and thus finding or emancipating the true self, is a legitimation of the lived experience of a group of women who lived a liberated life before and alongside feminism. Feminism is part of this story. Its normalisation of narratives of female autonomy, of a female selfhood, independent of essentialist notions of identity, and its commitment to an academic practice that listens to women's voices, records and analyses their experiences, and thereby contributes to the empowerment and collectivity of women, still has relevance, I think, today. For historians like me, who attended comprehensive school, first in my family to attend university, who arrived in academia actually quite surprised, who has found herself through women's history and feminist scholarship, Listening to women's voices has been revelatory and empowering. The aim of feminist oral history was to recover, record and empower the voices of women. Some of us didn't realise that in the process we would be discovering our own selves. Thank you very much.